So thank you, Charles. Great to be here today. It's a long journey. So this project, actually, I'm the architect. I'm also the homeowner. I should say my wife and myself are the funders. But there's been a range of fantastic material suppliers who helped us along the way, and they're all here today. So these things tend to be kind of cooperative and a lot of passion. So we'll go from there. Now, just to say that there's been again the collaborative bit. Shane Fenton of Wayne Moorhead Architects will be talking after me about the building energy modelling aspect to this, and Sarah Carrigan will be talking about life cycle assessment. So there's actually three of us in a sense. This is kind of a three-person talk, the largest part of which will be mine, but they're playing a very important role, and we're still exploring the project, and again, as a case study, its relevance to the national agenda and where we're going. Does that work for me? Great. Okay. So I do think it's important, though, however, to start with the greater context and the need for the urgent and deep cuts, all of that agenda. It needs to be mentioned. Carbon, circularity, those are kind of key themes that influence the project, and again, align very closely with the national agenda. And then moving into the case study. So it's two parts kind of broadly in this talk, in my talk, context, design, materials, construction, and then some of that kind of that working in action in a real project, not all of it clean or tidy. So just to say, I think there's some really important text that people need to be aware of. On Monday of this week, the synthesis report relating to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change sixth assessment, the synthesis report that gathers together all the different subsets of the sixth report was published. And I think we need to know about that as citizens of planet Earth, this little blue dot flying through outer space. The Climate Action Plan has recently been updated. That's one of the actions that the government is regularly now undergoing, and is very important, and sets out very key policies. I'm wearing a little badge here, so you know about the Sustainable Development Goals. Effectively, everything that we're doing from now on as a society needs to map back very clearly to sustainability. The Sustainable Development Goals are a fantastic framework to look at that through, and the government is tasking itself and is being audited on the basis of its engagement with that kind of seriousness. The LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI, now I think it's called the Low Energy Transformation Initiative. That's a fantastic design guide that is very, very relevant to an Irish context. And then on the left-hand side, a fantastic report looking at whole life carbon and the general engagement, and what are we doing in this industry in Ireland? What are the impacts from operational and embodied and so on? And again, where do we need to go, and pathways? So really, really significant high-level documents that I think most people should be aware of. This is the not so good news in terms of what we're doing as a planet, and the human species, which seems to be a little bit bent on destruction at the moment. And we can do things. They say that we're maybe the last generation, the first generation that really knows what it's doing, and the last generation that has a really strong ability to do something about it. Other generations will also, but I think what's important to recognize where we are. And greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, in 2030 implied by nationally determined contributions. So this is what all the various governments themselves are saying they will do. When you add all of the things up that they say they will do to address this issue, essentially it's not enough. We even what we're putting down on paper at the moment across the nations of the world is actually not enough. We really need to be more clear and dramatic about it. And we need to do that now. It's the emission changes, the emission reductions that we make now that will decide where we go as a planet, not just this species, but all the other species too. And it'll give us more choices to make in the future. So somebody saying we're allowing now for a great change, a great improvement, and we plan that to happen in 2030 or to plan that in 2040. It's not what we need to do. It's what we're doing now that matters. So we just need to have that understanding in every conversation that we have. and you know, be very much in favor of Greta Thunberg's approach. Anyone who is not doing something about this doesn't really have a right to complain about it. Actually, action, getting engaged, is one of the most powerful and informative and positive things you can do. And we can all do that in many, many different ways. And a lot of it is very healthy and exciting. So what is also good to say is that at least 18 countries, according to the IPCC, have sustained absolute production greenhouse gas emissions and consumption-based CO2 reductions for longer than 10 years. So it is actually happening. There are countries doing significant work, and it's the ongoing, it's not just going carbon neutral in 1 year, it's actually going carbon positive, or it's the year-on-year change, which is challenging, particularly in a political cycle and all those other things. But to me, it's a call for empathy. I mean, the biggest thing we need is a massive uncontrolled outbreak of empathy. You know, if we could actually look at our future generations and other people on the planet and say, actually, I recognize that person, I could be that person, I want to engage, I think nothing will be as transformative as that. The World Building Council are very strong on this, and like other bodies, in the Irish Green Building Council too, the Irish government, they're talking about roadmaps and how to get to those places and what we need to do about it. So as operational carbon is reduced, embodied carbon will continue to grow in importance as a proportion of the total emissions. While we must continue to focus on addressing operational carbon, we must now rapidly increase efforts to tackle embodied carbon emissions at a global scale too. So this case study project is a tiny piddling little project. It's 38 square meters, people, okay? But it's a project which is hopefully kind of showing as an example, one way of going about that. And there are many other ways of doing that. But you know, we need to talk about these things, we need to share them. Just in terms of some of the background stuff, and Sarah will be addressing this in a very coherent way. There's actually a European standard that engages with how do you assess the amount of carbon. You know, we're talking about CO2, carbon dioxide are equivalent. So methane can become, you know, these other gases all get gathered in there. A lot of that has to do with, you know, cows belching. It has to do with planes in the air. It has to do with lots of other things. But there's a huge amount of the embodied and operational carbon, the carbon that we're looking at, which relates to buildings and the built environment, how we transport things, how we make materials, how we work, how we maintain those buildings, how we demolish those buildings or reuse those materials, and then even elements which I think, to me, a lot of people in the historic building sector would often say, well, look, how do we recognize the quality of what's here, that wall there that's been here 1,000 years, or you know, how do we recognize the quality of what's in this building already? And even in this kind of, if I understand it correctly, module D at the end, there's actually structures and rigor and clarity around how you assess the value of what's already here, and how to look at lower embodied and lower operational carbon processes going forward, and design strategies and so on. So if we looked at operational, it's the one we're used to. It's the one, if you look at a BER certificate, building energy rating certificate, it'll give you an energy value. It'll also give you a carbon value. So the carbon impact of operating that building, or the energy impact of operating that building, that's on every BER certificate. So it's operation, it's fuel, it's all that sort of thing. Embodied carbon is where we're looking at the carbon emissions associated with extracting those materials, making those products, and the whole life cycle of a building, or the infrastructure associated. So you can see, if you look at the green rectangle, the green marquee, how far that extends. Can I do that? I think it's pretty obvious, but yeah, that whole area there, and actually, I think including this. No, that's right or wrong. Sarah will correct me. You can see there's a hell of a lot there that's going on, from that raw material extraction bit to the making of the material, transporting the material. People talk about cradle to cradle, cradle to grave, all these different kind of cycles. So embodied carbon talks about all of that. And then if we look at beyond the life cycle, this is this module D category, which I wasn't as aware of. Carbon emissions or emissions savings incurred due to reuse or recycling of materials, or emissions avoided due to using waste as a fuel source. So this, for the historic building movement, I've talked to lots of people over many, many years saying, why isn't there a method to account for the value of what's already here? There is. So the answer is there is, and it's here. And this is the method, and we need to engage with this, okay? And then the last of those whole life carbon. So this is an increasing focus. We recognize we've been engaged with that whole energy efficiency movement since the first and second oil crises in the 80s, since the advent of building regulations, since grant aid in 2008, all these different sorts of things. But we haven't talked enough, or even at all, about the other ways of addressing carbon. And it's the whole impact of carbon in the built environment we need to look at. So whole life carbon is kind of the new lingo around that. And it's talking about all of the embodied carbon and the operational carbon and this kind of module D category. So that's what the Green Building Council, the Irish Green Building Council, the World Building Council, the Irish government, the European Commission, all of these people are increasingly engaging with that space. And Kieran Cuff, who is an MEP, an Irish MEP, he's also an ex-lecturer from my university. He led the process in the European Parliament recently for the reform of the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, where they have begun to incorporate for the first time the impact of embodied carbon in that particular directive, which is the directive from which BERs and so on come. Okay, so he actually negotiated that with the national parliaments, the European Parliament, and the European Commission. He was at the centre of that triangle. And we can be very proud of that an Irish person has engaged in that. And it's not, these sorts of things are not things that are delivered on high without discussion. There's actually significant engagement happening, significant buy-in, and that's only in the last 2 weeks that document has been revised, and I think it'll be positive. If we look at the World Building Council just for a moment, I'm not going to go through all this, the World Building Council's roadmap that they're talking about. This was only published in 2019. I don't know when they started the project, but you can see they're already talking about a range of interesting things, even ambitious things happening in 2020, which is obviously gone, 2025, which is just ahead of us, and so on to a future of 2050. And in 2050, they're telling us all forms of energy used are from renewable or low carbon sources, and all processed carbon emissions are mitigated, and so on. So there's lots of things going on there. But if we just went to that lot up there, the designers who are mostly sitting in this room and the manufacturers who are mostly standing at the back of the room, if you were very simplistic about it. And we just delved in very, very kind of simply around that timeline of 2020 and 2025. Just some things I'm pulling out more on the designer side, that by 2020, all designers who are engaging with this World Building Council process will be signing up to roadmaps, appropriate roadmaps, to help us get to that 2050 carbon horizon and engage with low embodied carbon design processes. So again, we've tried in this cottage project to do a bit of that, not always the best way, but engaging there. And then by 2025, publicly share life cycle assessment data. And again, in this case study, we'll be sharing that with you today. And there'll be a proper published paper on this. We're not fully there. A lot of this is work in progress. And then proposing best practice embodied carbon targets and implementing circularity principles. So again, we're trying to do as we can some of that. We need case studies. The Irish government needs to be able to point to case studies. The Irish designers need to be able to point to it. Building manufacturers, importers need to be able to say, there's a market here. And actually there's a market to import a product, but actually even better. And we've got people like that today, for instance, from Acoustic Materials saying, not only do we think we want to import this product because it's a fully recycled product, or it's deep circularity or low embodied carbon or whatever, breathable, blah, 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 but actually we've the ambition to start manufacturing that product with Irish materials, even waste materials, in the near future. So that kind of localizing and again, taking infrastructure and travel out of it. So that kind of ambition, we need that at all the different players. So if we look at O'Hegarty and Canaan for a moment, some of their kind of findings recently, really significant papers there. In the built environment, it's responsible for 30 to 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland, okay? So 40% of everything. The reason there's a variance is because, 2008, we had lots and lots of built environment, lots of building going on. 2012, not so much. So there's a variance that can happen, but that's a huge proportion of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's broadly equal to everything from agriculture, okay? So there's a lot going on there. It's something we really need to deal with. And we have the capacity as clients, as specifiers, as manufacturers and so on to do that. If all that's, this is worrying, if all that is proposed in development plans is built in the next few years, built environment greenhouse gases could increase to 3 times the targeted level by 2030. What that's telling us is we don't have the budget, the carbon budget, not the financial budget. We don't have the carbon budget to do all the great plans that we'd like to do. We have a very limited amount of funding, a resource, if you think about the carbon side, available to us. We have to do extraordinary things. We've got a massive housing crisis. We've, all the different things we're facing, but we need to begin to think, what do we prioritize? And simply because you own the land and you have the money, or you're the developer with the great capacity to turn a buck, that isn't enough. Ireland needs something else. So we need to begin to have that kind of conversation, which is uncomfortable, but it's really, really important. We can't simply build our way out of this one. We need to do things carefully. And a lot of that must be there for retrofit, because 90% of all the buildings that we will have in 2050, we have right now. So retrofit has to be a much bigger part of what we're doing, and clever retrofit. Embodied carbon emissions are about 14% of all reported greenhouse gas emissions. So above we were talking about all of the carbon emissions, okay? Now we're beginning to focus down on the embodied carbon emissions, okay? So that's quite a significant proportion. And if you looked at the concrete steel part of that, 70% is associated with concrete and steel. So extraordinary, wonderful products, amazing materials that can do extraordinary things. We're way, way, way overusing them. There's many cases where you can have a fantastic glulam beam that can do what the steel does. There's many cases that mass timber could do what concrete's doing. There's many cases where we don't need concrete at all. There's many cases where we could design out, lose 50% of the mass, increase the low carbon aggregate forms. There's a company in the north side of Dublin that actually makes a certified, called Greenstone, the product's called Greenstone, a certified aggregate. So they've broken up parts of Dublin Airport runway or from buildings, but instead of just grinding something down and saying, here's a thing, and we can use this for fill, they're actually doing an auditing process. And with EPA and NSAI approval, they were the first company in Ireland to provide a certified recycled product that can actually be used structurally. So that's an aggregate in new concrete made from old concrete effectively. You can also use the binder, EcoSam or equivalent, low embodied. I mean, there's lots of things we can make it a much better specification. We can also use a hell of a lot less of it, and we can challenge as to why we're using it at all. And then some things like basements, car parks, things like that, we could actually say, in fact, we're going to design those out. So there's lots of different things we can do when we start thinking about it. Efficiency improvements will drive operational carbon downwards, but Ireland's targets will not be achieved unless we also focus on embodied carbon very significantly. So we've got to do this, and actually, you know what? It can produce better and healthier buildings too, and it can also drive some amount of the economy and innovation, but we've got to do it. So if we looked at the flow of residential and non-residential operational and embodied carbon, you can see, look at the boom, you can see 2005, 6, 7. You can even see a little bit of the impact of 9/11, where there's a little bit of a drop after 2002, but you can see kind of maybe the craziness in retrospect. And you can see where we're going again. We're kind of going nearer back to that territory. If we look at the residential part, you can see operational carbon, the energy we use to power our systems, our homes, and so on, is the biggest part of that. And this, bear in mind, includes plug loads. So this is you watching the TV, or that lovely desk lamp, or your smartphone, and all of those sorts of things. It's not just heating the building, and so on. And then residential embodied carbon is about a third of that figure that you're seeing for operational carbon. So it's a big chunk. It's not as big, but as this gets tighter, that also must be addressed, as we just saw from the previous report. And together, residential embodied carbon and residential operational carbon constitute 60% of all the built environment greenhouse gases. So these are big things, okay? And we're now coming down to the level of the homes that we live in and what we do in those homes. I mean, this is becoming about us now, and not just a big policy thing. Now, this is probably an incredibly significant statement and an incredibly significant act, and there probably hasn't been enough talk about it. This was passed in June 2021, and it was only last summer that we agreed to sectoral targets. And you might remember that the leader of the Green Party was being slagged off roundly on Twitter and wherever else, because he was talking about these things and trying to actually engage with with different sectors about what the targets would be for that sector. And each sector needs to understand, you can't just say it's them. And certainly it's not good enough if we say we're going to continue flying as much as we do, but buildings need to become more energy efficient, or, oh, it's the cows, or whatever. We need to engage in our different sectors, and we need to engage as a society together. but this is what's behind it. The state shall, so as to reduce the extent of further global warming, pursue and achieve by no later the end of the year 2050, the transition to a climate resilient, biodiversity rich, environmentally sustainable and climate neutral economy. That's what we need to be about. And that's something worth signing up for. Now, the key features of the Act are putting our 2050 climate target in law. That's been done there. Carbon budgets, including sectoral targets, they were only agreed last summer. So we're really at, the beginning of a kind of a structured approach to this that goes beyond any one particular party or a policy. It's actually what we're doing as a society. Annually revised climate action plans. You saw the 2023 one just earlier. Strengthened role for Climate Change Advisory Council and new oversight and, of course, accountability. So it's good stuff. The Irish Green Building Council is leading the conversation on this nationally, and I think they need to be hugely commended, but also supported in their engagement. And just one little thing that for some of you that aren't aware of it, there is now a new Carbon Designer tool, because Carbon Designer for Ireland tool, it's free. They're providing loads of training on it. It does relate to, I think, more new build and bigger projects, but it's the kind of thing we should be engaging with, and they're very interested in expanding that further. So kind of moving from that higher policy into kind of how we actually act and engage with the design process, and even how we manage the waste that comes from our kitchen or our house or whatever. I think it's really important, reduce, reuse, recycle. I mean, my children in school used to have a jingle, a song about reduce, reuse, recycle. And it really struck me a few years ago when I was first teaching about this, that it's a hierarchy. It's actually a waste hierarchy. It's not just a number of lines. And when we talk about recycle as being the kind of thing we talk about all the time, it's almost the worst thing you can do. There's lots of things we need to do before that. So we need to rethink, and that's what the case studies are about. We need to refuse lots of different kind of engagements with materials or consumption or whatever. We're addicted to consumption as a society. And of course, there are lots of businesses that want us to be addicted, and it can feed a need, an itch, whatever. But we need to get better at understanding why we need to refuse, and that being a positive thing. The Americans have a very corny expression, what no allows a greater yes. So it's terribly corny. You kind of cringe when you say it, but actually, I do. But actually, it's powerful. What no allows a greater yes. Repairing, there's a directive from the EU coming out about repair and the right to repair, an actual citizen right that you give me a product that I can actually repair. My children use little scooters, not e-scooters, they're just little, they're children. We've replaced different elements of those so many different times because I think it's a Swiss company that manufactured them, allow us to do it. And a new set of ball races is €5, not a bother. You get a pack, a week later, swap them out in the system, and their little scooter keeps going. Fantastic, really simple, designed as part of the process. Reducing, obviously, that's really important. Do we need to build that less? One of the things that they found recently is that for all of the energy efficiencies that we've incorporated in our domestic building stock has been wiped out by the fact that in the same period of time since the building regulations started in 1991, we've increased the size of our buildings. So larger houses, even though they're more energy efficient, are using the same amount of energy overall. Not helpful, really. Great that every bedroom has an ensuite. Great that you've got your, blah, 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 blah. You can have a big conversation about that. But we need to understand we're not actually doing as well as in some of this. We're working hard to stand still. So we need to kind of think about those things. We obviously, reusing is incredibly important, and reusing at the highest level possible. If possible, not reusing at the level of recyclate, ground down or some sort of base material where that product's been brought down to its lowest level, but actually at the level of a product, or even at the level of a component, which is an assembly of products in a, let's say, a building wall or a larger element. So there's a lot of thinking that could go on there about reuse, and only then recycling. Okay, below recycling is incineration and landfill. So it's almost the worst thing you can do, but it's interesting. It's the one that we always talk about. So, it's not bad, but the other ones above it are far, far more important. And again, that feeds into a historic building and energy efficiency conversation. If you wanted to start talking about this in a more sophisticated way, that little kind of conversation about those 6 graphics and so on feeds into this bigger discussion, which is about circularity. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is probably the leading body in the world addressing this. And what they would talk about is separating out the biomaterials, which you can see on the left in green, from the technical materials, which you see on the right in blue. And on the table in front of you, I've got on the right-hand side, there's a range of biomaterials. In the middle, there are post-consumer waste construction materials, and including technical materials. And on the right are two actually relatively high carbon materials. The one on the far left is being the worst. So you can see here, what we're being asked to do is to engage as much as possible in this space, where we're collecting, it's the reuse space. It's that continued engagement. Then there's the kind of remanufacturing space. Then we're beginning to break it down into smaller and smaller elements, back to what they call a recyclate, like ground, cullet, glass cullet, like dust, glass dust almost, from that bottle. You're beginning to go back to a manufacturing process. Then you're actually going into recycling your green bin or whatever else. I'm sorry, the green bin is a way into many of these things, but back here you're into kind of almost starting again, and you're trying to replace a virgin stream with this stream. But it's far, far better to be lower down here. But it's also a good thing to separate these out. Don't combine them. Keep your biomaterials separate from your technical materials and so on. So there's lots of thinking about this, and a lot of it's really exciting and results in wonderful products and maybe a better way of thinking. What's really worth understanding is that Ireland is appallingly bad at this. We're actually very good at many things, but we're not really good when it comes to circularity. Romania is a bit worse, but countries that you might not think of so much. I mean, okay, we can always talk about the Finns, we can always talk about whoever, I don't know, the Austrians, but the Latvians and Lithuanians and Croatians, I don't know, Malta, they're countries doing way, way better than us. And then right at the top there, you've got the Dutch, you've got the Belgians, and even the French. You wouldn't think they might be as innovative, but there's lots of innovation there and real deep engagement and understanding with that. And that's where we need to be. I mean, even if we just got to where the European mean is, we'd be doing bloody well compared to where we are now. So we've a long way. There's massive opportunities for us to increase our circularity. And those early steps in increase will actually be quite simple. Like any beginning of an engagement, there are easy wins. There are more easy wins. Much harder for the Netherlands to increase its level of circularity at this stage. So if we were talking about strategies to increase circularity in building design, you could talk about understanding that retrofit is a way to almost inherently have a lower carbon form of building, engagement with building. So in that, it's about a third the embodied carbon of rebuilding. So, government is going to have to start increasingly stop planning permissions for large rebuilds of commercial buildings, but we've also got to look at the quality of the houses that we have. And so it's a conversation at every different level. There's also obviously multiple other benefits in terms of patrimony, streetscape, in terms of architecture, culture, air quality. I mean, there could be multiple different benefits, settled communities, etc., from engaging with retrofit and building less. We need to use less building materials. We need to refuse works more often. We don't need to do that thing, that extension, or whatever. Or actually, we could do something a little bit more modest, meets our needs, and it's 10%, it's 20% less space, it's 20%, maybe 30, 40% less materials. We need to maintain and repair more. We need to reduce materials and then also structurally optimize. I mean, in this project, you'll see examples where I've done that. But a conversation, very often an awkward conversation with a fellow designer, in this case, maybe an engineer, where you're saying, does it need to be a 400 mil deep footing? Could it be a 250 mil deep footing? Or those kind of conversations. It's a timber frame single story extension. Why does it need foundations the size of Croke Park? Like actually challenging those kind of things. So even just volume of material, and then, like I said earlier on, then moving on to the next column, which is about the specification of those materials. So shifting to low carbon, renewable, reuse specifications. All the materials used in my little case study, they were all already in Ireland. I do remember talking to a fellow colleague in TU Dublin many years ago when I was showing him a long German screw for kind of timber frame construction, and I said, that's the kind of thing we need. This would allow us to do X, Y, Z. And he said, yes, Joseph, that's fine, but we don't have those in Ireland. And my answer was, they're in a company called Masonry Fixings in Ballyfermot. So, if you don't know that they're available, then you're not going to engage in a conversation that allows those things to be used in that project. There's so much stuff already here that we can avail of. Localizing it is the next step. So transitioning the supply chain from over-reliance on imported products. There are amazing products here. Many of these products here today are imported. We need those products now, but we need to the next stage in the conversation where we begin to make the Irish version of those. And then obviously carbon intense. There's many products that are in Ireland that are wonderful quality products that are extremely high intense carbon, and some of these are exported all around the world. We need to have that awkward conversation too. And obviously moving to local, low carbon construction products, so on. And then, you know, embracing circularity, specifying reuse and remanufacture, stimulating the market. Having this conversation today is stimulating the market. I mean, in this case, you're the market or the people that you work with, and design for disassembly, because we need to be aware that there's a future where that steel beam is not available for sale. It's in your building and it needs to be reused. If you begin to think about buildings, and this is kind of a radical way of thinking, as a temporary slowdown in a material flow, you know, that's a kind of a way to start thinking. And how can I best ensure that those people in the future, because the future will be a lot about stuff, where does the stuff come from? And if we can start kind of saying, well, like, actually, I'm going to allow that material to get the best chance of being reused at its optimum, that's a really important way to think. That's very much for designers to engage with, and again, manufacturers. And putting something together this way rather than that way could be the difference. You know, is it a screw fix? Is it nail fix? What are those junctions? How does that come together? Those conversations now actively impact upon the ability to reuse those materials in the future. So there's a bit of context. So case study. The case study building is number 4, Findlater Street, which I think is that little one, that one there. No, it's that one. Which one is it? I think, yeah, there it is. There's number 4. That little building there. And it's at the back of what was probably a field that the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Company, which was made up of nice people like Lord Ivy and Mr. Findlater, the wine merchant. You can actually read them there. Mr. Findlater, the wine merchant, Mr. Black, all men, of course, Mr. Kinahan, and then Mr. Sullivan. And if you look at it, there's a similar development somewhere near Howes Cross where you can see another range of names, and they were the board members. They were all the board members who were making social housing for profit. You know, this was a business proposition, but it was an appropriate business proposition where they felt the deserving working class should be better accommodated. The undeserving working class, they're those without a trade, none of our business. They'll find their way, but the deserving working class deserve better accommodation. What's really funny about it is that Aberdeen Street, they couldn't agree on the main thoroughfare through their little development. Okay, they couldn't agree. And what do a group of men sipping brandy or port or something do when egos are at stake and they can't agree such an important name? They turn around and say, well, the wife of the Viceroy, that's where we'll go. So Lady Aberdeen got the name for the central street in the development. It is actually a very sophisticated architectural scheme, which will be represented in the write-up of the case study, in terms of pediments and faux pediments and pilasters and all sorts of architectural engagement of this front red brick terrace, and then this line of terracing, these buildings here, and then the central on either side. And then wrapping around that are these window cottages. And like I said, that's one of them there. You can see the drainage plan laid out. This is from 1880, design is from 1885. It was built between 1885 and 1886. So this particular house, it had structural internal walls. These were all structural mass concrete. And you can see obviously mass concrete. So mass concrete, you'd say, oh, no, they weren't building in 1886 with mass concrete. Actually, they were. And if you look at the old Dublin, the Dubliner magazine, the Dublin Building magazine in the Irish Architectural Archive, you can see loads of geeks writing about cool concrete mixes and about formwork and getting really excited in 1886 about concrete. And I'll talk more about the concrete later on. It's single story, 3-bay, mid-terrace cottage, camber arched door opening. Actually, yes, that's wrong. There's a camber there. Boot scraper, really practical. Okay, that's missing too. It's just there. Sash windows, high ceilings, and so on. These are the sash windows appear in the main street. Oops, we'll go back. These all have sash windows, and the quality, I think, is in the brickwork, the detailing, and the architectural schema. When you move to these guys, I think the quality is in the height of the space. Possibly, I think this is fairly simple there, but I think also the windows. So they chose where they would spend their money. And these were beautiful cast iron, chinoiserie style central pivot windows. And almost all of them are gone. And I think there's only 2 left in the development, one from very, very small little cottage, and the other was taken from a tip from the other side of the site, where these owners said, can we use those? Can we take it out of your tip? And they said, yes, they got it, they refurbished it and they installed it, and it looks beautiful on Kierman Street. I was hoping in terms of budget that we might be able to make new windows like these and maybe have modern double glazing behind them, and budget simply didn't allow. So that ambition didn't happen. But there was quality even in these simple buildings, and then in some of the plastering detail and the lovely brickwork up here, even though we're talking about really modest structures. This is how we found it. O'Devney Gardens is directly behind it, and O'Devney Gardens, when it started, I think was quite an exemplary development, well managed, and then over time, as these things happen, it declined. Children from there, teenagers, used to run up and down these roofs, on the slate roofs, regularly, apparently, and you can imagine what that did to the roofs. But it was the funnest thing to do possible, as I understand it, and therefore this fencing was put in place behind the boundary wall at a certain point. When we arrived, one of the most extraordinary things I found is this photograph here. That's a dishing in the yard, okay? That's a downpipe, which is this downpipe. So you can't really see it, but there's a dishing that goes across the yard. This was incredibly overgrown with plants and so on. But since that dishing, I think it may be the original dishing, but certainly this appallingly bad extension built maybe in the mid-70s or something like that, had that dishing going right under it to the lovely cast iron gully here, which says DAD, as in Dublin Artisan Dwelling. That gully there, that's the same dishing that we're seeing here, which means we have a highway for vermin right under the floor, for the little old lady who was there before we moved in, and that downpipe took the water from both these roofs, all of that roof, all of that yard, all down that downpipe, and all into that gully, right under that lady's floor. And she had kind of wire mesh in all sorts of places to try and resist the vermin. So, appallingly cynical development, really. And of course, not a shred of insulation, blah, 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 blah. And all the original features were gone, and there was rot, and there was mold, and there was obviously vermin. We had a wonderful case of lead piping. You can see it here and here. This is coming from the outside. You can even see the pipe. I think the pipe travels there somewhere. That's it there, you see? And that pipe was lead piping for both houses, the cottage beside this as well. So we were delivering, as owners, when we realized we were delivering lead-enriched water to our neighbour free. Weren't we good? So one of the first things we had to do, obviously, was separate out the water systems. And we ended up, the best way to do it to inconvenience them as little as possible was to create an easement so that their pipe, Qualpec, or high quality appropriate, Hydrodare, I think, appropriate water pipe went to the back of their house, plugged into their system in a way that didn't inconvenience them at all. And then we wrote an easement so that we would acknowledge that their water supply came through our subfloor, and that was fine. But these are the kind of things that you need to look at, and they've got nothing to do with energy efficiency, but they've got everything to do with life and quality and health and neighborliness and all these. We've got a stack that is in particularly poor condition. We've got cracked pots, we've got haunching missing, got all the lovely growies that you're used to seeing. We've got original line pointing that's falling away. You've got all sorts of repair works. You can see bits of Gunther and How's Your Father. You can see different types of slates, including asbestos. You can see lovely gaps of light. You can see the parging falling off. You can see the slating, the bedding mortar for the ridge tiles ready to go. You can see kind of temporary fixes upon temporary fix upon temporary fix, all those good things. And then if you go back to the plan, you've got the original scullery, the original coal store, and the original privy. So I'll just take you back there for a second. Scullery, coal store, privy, still there, buried within the extension. But we couldn't use them in that form. So they did go, but interesting to see that footprint still there. So in terms of why did we buy it and what's the inherent value, you've seen some of the problems, but there's also value, and there's wonderful value. I'm here with Kieran Cuff, who's a neighbour. He actually lives nearby, and this is the development. This is the 1886 Dadco development, and just there is the, that's O'Devny Gardens. That bit there is the kind of 1920s Dadco development, one of the last things they did. I love it, again, a beautiful development. But we're 13 minutes from the GPO, 10 minutes from the family home, 11 minutes cycle to Christchurch or Houston Station, even the Papal Cross. This extraordinary location to be in, and albeit it's modest and small, it's a great place to live your life. if you can make that work for you. You know, that's a message I would have, an urban message, I suppose. And you're in the middle of a settled community of people who like being there, lots of flower pots, lots of benches outside, and you're kind of plugging into something there, which I think is really valuable. In terms of other inherent value, form and fabric, well, the fabric is here, the building is standing. Okay, it wasn't in great condition, we'll talk about that, but there's a lot here that's actually already has some quality, and that needs to be acknowledged. Notionally, there isn't any heat loss to your neighbor, it's mid-terrace, so again, there's a value in that, in any kind of insulation strategy. I think one that does not get talked about enough is that there's a large internal volume, albeit it's a small property. It has quite a good height. It feels bright, it feels airy, it feels generous. When you walk into a small property and you have a mean feeling and a small ceiling height, you know, that kind of stays with you. When you walk into something and it's large and bright, that's nice, it's pleasant. But not only that, it also has an environmental benefit in that if you look at this volume 1, double the volume, treble the volume, you can actually see that this is a volume that takes longer for contaminants to reach a kind of a steady state concentration. The air quality in a larger volume like this is actually going to be better. Its ability to deal with moisture or other contaminants is greater. And that's an inherent characteristic that I think they understood. The people with muddy work boots walked into that building and you know, the building could take that. And so on. So that's something we wanted to retain. The idea for me of coming down half a meter here and then having the meanest possible, and it's been done all around this development, the meanest possible little kind of mezzanine area above it is appalling to me. You know, and I understand the argument at 38 square meters, what are you going to do? You want more space, but I think you lose something that maybe isn't talked about. And then even in terms of other values, the actual drawing there is incorrect for that particular location. On that side of the development, the undercroft, which was probably the original field line, the actual line of that field on the day that they came on site in 1885 is actually much deeper than it looks in this drawing. So in fact, we hit 600 millimeters of space from the top of the floor finish to the bottom of the void available to us. It was slightly sloped, unlike you're seeing there, but that's a lot of void that we could use without excavating, without doing a great deal of work to it. And of course, we had a good ceiling void, attic void above that we could also use. So these are all things about thinking about strategy and where we can go. If you look at the form factor, this is something that was going to bite us. Fergal talked really eloquently earlier on about form factor and the value of that Northgate Georgia Street house, which had a form factor of 1.03, something like that. And the other product, the Albany Road, the earlier Albany Road was 2.05 or something, was it? This is unbelievable. This cottage, okay, once extended, the extension that we chose to do, has a form factor of 3.15. That's the form factor of a detached bungalow. So even though it's mid-terrace, you know, we talk a lot about mid-terrace, and mid-terrace is great, and we don't lose heat to side, and you've got that settled community and the urban density and all these good things. But the form factor for a building like this was actually really high and really worked against us. So we had to do really significant work in order to achieve something that might be Enerfit, which was one of the ambitions we had early on in the project. We never got to A2. Fergal was very kind earlier on. We didn't get to A2, but we had harder work, we had more work to do because our form factor was so poor. Look how easy it was for that Northgate Georgia Street property to get to C2, where to the form factor of whatever it was 1.07. It's inherently efficient in its form. This is a very inefficient form, albeit it's mid-terrace. And when we charted that across the case study houses and also the SEAI's database of research tool, which is a wonderful resource from all the different properties that have a BER on their SEAI database. This was 2-3 years ago. That's the blue dots, and then charting the form factor against their date for the case study projects, whether they're retrofitted or unretrofitted, green versus brown. And then we've dropped in Findlater Street. You can see even in terms of the buildings that we're looking at in Built to Last, it's an outlier. So it's really difficult to work with something that is that inefficient in its inherent geometry, regardless of what's in each wall or bit of building fabric. Again, look at Henrietta Street below 1. That's now the Tenement Museum. You know, well worth visiting, by the way. Fantastic museum. And you can see the other buildings. I'm not going to go on. But really kind of significant thing to have to address. So how are we going to address it? What are our high-level approaches to insulating this building, to engaging with the building? Wonderful document here, the Solid Wall Guide from Bristol. If you start looking at what we had, 120 square meters of floor of thermal envelope. So that's the roofs, the windows, the floor, the walls that are external walls, and so on. So the form factor you just saw calculated. When you break that down percentage-wise, windows and doors, 9.25%. The existing walls, actually, in this case, only that are external. There are existing walls that are internal, but the existing walls that are part of the thermal envelope, only 10.7% in this project, once you exclude the windows and the doors. The new walls are greater, 16%, but look at the floor and the roof, about 30%, 31% each. Really, really significant. This is where we need to be spending most of the energy, most of the engagement in terms of insulation. And none of this is visible in terms of streetscape. All of this has an impact. So, that should really influence the strategy going forward. And then, of course, going back to what Fergus said earlier on about air tightness, I just want to say, and I'll say this every time in the conversation, there is no conflict whatsoever between breathability and air tightness. Any notion that air tightness means plastic bags are unhealthy, or the building can't breathe, or I can't breathe, is absolute nonsense, and it's I don't even maybe propaganda. You can have an absolutely fully vapor open, capillary open, historic, beautiful, fully airtight building, fully breathable, no conflict. Air tightness is about removing the gaps and the cracks, removing the careless construction, actually understanding and then having proper ventilation, proper air quality installed using good systems. That's what air tightness is about. So now coming back to mass concrete, when this is what we realized we were dealing with. We bought a building where they really didn't understand the technology they were building with. In 1885 and 1886, they were playing around. They obviously felt it was a good idea. Dadco were probably innovative. Maybe they got a good price point for the supply, whatever, but they didn't really understand what they were doing. You can see evidence of day joints. You can see day joint there, day joint there. That might actually be too high a lift for one day. A little bit of clay pot, a little bit of how's your father. Lots of cracking, poor consolidation, inadequate amount of cement, poorly agitated, poorly consolidated, and then pebble-based aggregate, large aggregate, overly large aggregate, and uncontrolled types of ranges of aggregate. So this is unfortunately part of the thing that we've all inherited, people who own these buildings. And there are lots of other buildings in Dublin where you can see from that period early poor quality mass concrete, and that we have to engage with, and we want to save it, but we also don't want it to bite us. And in this case, we realized that if we kept the internal walls, which are only about 80 millimeters wide, 80 to 90 millimeters wide, but 4 meters high of mass concrete, where this was what we're seeing everywhere, or a lot of it, that there was no way we could predict that we wouldn't have a very big problem having spent all the money at the end of the project, and that some of these walls mightn't again crack or move or whatever. So we removed the internal walls. These are new walls, they're stud walls, they're acoustically isolated walls and so on. And, I think it was a hard thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, actually. And if we go on, that also enabled us to ensure that we could have a single bed in this location by adjusting this new wall 100 millimeters. It allowed us to actually slightly narrow this room, widen this room, slightly narrow this room such that it would still take quite comfortably a double bed. It's a small double bedroom. Some of you will get to see it later on, but it actually is a comfortable space, and it's a reasonable size double bed. But those little adjustments give back a little bit of room to this central space, make this room useful for somebody in a way that it wouldn't be as useful otherwise. And by having these walls removed during the construction, it also allowed us to put in a single floor condition, which was simpler and more cost effective, than later on. In terms of the radon, we measured radon on site, and it was extremely low, 1/10 or something of the lowest level that they talk about in the regulations. After construction, we're now measuring radon again, as you should, and as so rarely happens. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to actually ensure, because these walls had a lot of moisture stress, a lot of it coming through the cracks that due to the concrete and so on over time. So when we arrived, there was really high moisture content. There was plaster falling off, there was floorboards rotting, and all these sorts of things. So one thing we wanted to do was make sure that the walls and the floor together worked as a system in terms of moisture management in a very, very low radon context. Okay, and as you're allowed in Part L, we put in a radon sump but we have the foamed glass aggregate, which is over there underneath, which I'm showing you more about, a geotextile, compacted twice, geotextile and 100 mil of finecrete above that. There is no DPM and there is no radon barrier, and I'm okay with that in this project. In another project, you could say you must do it, but we did put in a radon summer. And then we run a pipe at a slightly uphill slope, and we use the flue because we were decarbonizing in this house. We're going to electric heating and high quality air and so on. We didn't need the flue. We felt actually a little bit of draw from that radon sump so that anything that does come there in the future, if anything does, can move away, we felt was a good passive measure. You may have remembered that the original door was here and there was a little window there. We wanted to be able to have people, you know, eating and drinking and looking south on this side and cooking up against the wall here. So there wasn't a lot of wall left, like I said. So we ended up with a situation where that wall came away, and we put a little steel goalpost arrangement there, which you'll see later on. But these were kind of high-level design decisions. We also wanted to make sure there was a very generous shower room and again, properly ventilated and all those good things. So you can begin to see here in orange the kind of schedule of demolitions that were involved. So yeah, but they were carefully considered, you know. Okay, so in terms of the strategies, super low U values in the floor, roof, and the timber frame extension, appropriate U values for the solid walls. Air tightness, we were looking for less than 1. Well, it should be an N50 of less than 1 to achieve the Retrofit standard. But just for the moment, let's talk about Q50. We were hoping to get in that territory anyway. What we achieved was 1.6 after a good lot of work. We were disappointed, but that's still nationally significant. You know, there was a lot of learning in it. The builders were very good builders, but they weren't as focused on air tightness. We did bring in a guru who we'll talk about later on for the installation, the cellulose installation on the air tightness, which really helped, but there was a little bit of work they needed to do beyond that. And then generally we went for the decarbonizing, as we all should be doing, a decarbonizing approach and and in this case, I initially was looking at MVHR, mechanical ventilation heat recovery, with a heat pump with a cylinder in a compact unit, and the system was a Nelan Compact P, but frankly, we couldn't afford it. And 1 square meter of floor area out of 38 square meters is quite a lot, but also even the cost, we felt we couldn't afford it. And frankly, the government grant aid wasn't enough for that. We have allowed for that to happen in the future, but what was incredibly important was we did install in that context proper ventilation that was also certified. So the demand controlled MEV system we put in is for Areco, and Areco are here today. And yeah, there are those things about phasing a project and working on tight budgets, which definitely affected us. We got no grant aid in this project. If the material suppliers were the few people who were, you know, I don't say few people, but the material suppliers that we're talking to are very forward-thinking companies, and we were able to engage with them, and that was really useful. But otherwise, we paid for the lot ourselves. And like I said, we have allowed for phasing in the future and facilitated that. Actively facilitating that. In terms of moisture managing, no radon barriers, DPM capillary breaks, only where needed. Minimize the petrochemically based materials as much as possible. The radon sump I talked about already. We installed limecrete slab on the 500 millimeters of foam glass aggregate. That's kind of allowing the whole floor to be breathable and actually not increasing the moisture stress on the roof. If moisture can move through the floor and through the wall, then there's less stress on the wall. If moisture can only move through the wall, you're focusing that area, which is what you do with a radon barrier or DPM, and then it can have an impact on how that wall dries out. There's no DPC, it needs to be said. There's no DPC there. If there were DPC, we'd be having a different conversation. The DPC is a damp-proof course within the depth of the wall. Okay, and then the paper cellulose in the attic, we realized that it does slump. In that form, so it's loose laid cellulose in the attic, so we're allowing it to slump 50 millimeters. That's fine. It'll slump to 500, only 500, and it's fine. In the timber frame walls, it's blown at a higher density and it doesn't slump. And then multiple wood fiber products and so on, and there's a selection of materials there which we'll talk about. And then even using a rain screen to the rear is actually a moisture managing technique, because you're removing liquid water. You're removing liquid water from driving rain, and therefore the wall only has to deal with vapor. So that again helps the moisture stress. So there's all these different kind of strategies going on, and many of them are passive. I don't want to go through this whole list because it's a bit detailed, but there's a range. The blue materials are the technical materials, the green are the biomaterials, and if I just do that, you can all just kind of let your eyes pass across, and you can see the companies that were involved, and many of those companies are here today. So that's quite a lot of circular materials. 8 biomaterials at least. There actually might be 9, and then 4 technical materials. And it's the first use of the AM Eco Board, the acoustic material Eco Board, which is from, here it is here. This is from Tetra Pak. I'm sorry you can't see this online, but this is from Tetra Pak waste. It's either Czech or Slovak Tetra Paks. But the guys from Acoustic Materials, Stephen and Louis at the back of the room, they have the ambition to start manufacturing in Ireland quite soon. And they're also looking at other products. But that's all we need to make a quality. This has particularly high acoustic characteristics. And it's also been an excellent tested racking board. And like I said, the first timber frame in Ireland that's been used is here. There's an example where you can say waste is not a problem. Waste is a resource. And actually you can get from that, quote unquote waste, a premium product that could even attract a premium price, but is valuable and can form an easy part of the circular economy. So it's that kind of thinking, and you can see that in a whole range of those products there. And most of those are lined up on the wall, on the table in front of us. Oh yeah, and the first use of Findlater, which is a Galician company in Spain, the first use of the thermopine external cladding. So that's a long life cladding product that doesn't require treatment, and it has its inherent resilience through a pressured steam heat kind of process. And Juan here can talk to you further about that. So again, quite innovative, albeit 38 square meters. Here's the GA section, and you get a sense of the depth of the cellulose. So that figure is actually wrong. We ended up not insulating in here, because actually, if we, that's the services zone where there's recessed downlighters and so on. If we didn't insulate in here, I just realized it'd be easier in the future, if we wish to put in ducting for a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system, which we'd already originally intended, but could not afford at this stage. And the guy who's installing the cellulose insulation, and it's all recycled, it's all wonderful, was just saying it's super easy to put in 550. It's like I said, slump to 500. It's all up there, it's all fine, and it's easy. So that's actually empty there in this case. There's blown cellulose in these areas and then in the timber frame. And actually that is PIR board, which is the final product on the left of the table, which is often a bit of it's a fossil rich material. It's very vapor tight. It has a fantastic thermal conductivity. And it's actually made in Ireland, but it's something I try and avoid, to be honest, because it has a high carbon impact. But in this case, I felt in a narrow area where I couldn't increase further outwards, and I didn't want to increase further inwards. If that's the depth of the joist, and if that's fulfilling the joist with cellulose, such Demstadt from Ecological Building Systems, I'm using a super breather membrane again from them above that, and that allows a timber joist, because it's always important to protect the original structure. I'm allowing the timber joists not to be sacrificial. That's the problem when you put a non-hygroscopic or a capillary vapor closed material between timber joists. You're creating a situation that the timber is then the thing that takes the moisture, and the structure then becomes the thing that gets stressed. That's not a good idea. But where you have cellulose, which comes from timber, alongside the timber joisting, and you've got battens and counter battens above, you've got a situation that you've got a high level of ventilation occurring above the breather membrane. You've got a fantastic ability for moisture to move and do what it needs to do. And then below that, on the side which is more appropriate to have vapor tightness, I've got a high performance thermal insulation, which is continuous slabbing. And I felt that was appropriate, but it was a small area. Here, I'll talk about that in a moment, but they're kind of measures for upstairs. If you think about it, people are putting on, they're re-roofing all the time with just battens. So the batten is this guy, okay? The counter batten is the one below it. The double line you see there is the counter batten. By doing that, you're allowing moisture. On a rainy day, water gets in behind the slates. You're allowing water to flow down. And it doesn't matter if the membrane is tight or the membrane is sagging. If you look at historic buildings, very often, when they started putting in bituminous membranes at the early 20th century, they would sag. And that sag saved the batten, because the moisture would get in, the water would get in and dribble down, and it wouldn't hit the batten. What we're doing nowadays commonly in industry and constantly in retrofit, but also new build, is we're still putting in the battens that we're used to doing in our culture of building. We're pulling tight a membrane, and every time water comes down, it hits each batten all the way down. And that's a really stupid thing to do in terms of moisture management. And I don't know why there is that kind of, why people aren't making that move. So we thought it was very important to put in a batten, counter batten here, to allow those battens last longer, but also to allow us to go full fill here with a tight membrane. And then, like I said, the other measures in terms of PIR and so on. So that's the kind of thinking that you need to apply to these things. We've a lovely roof light here from Tradecraft there at the back of the room as well. And that can be remotely controlled. It's triple glazed, it's low thermal bridging, etc. If we move on, I'm not going to go through these. You can see these values yourselves, but these are super. Sorry, that's a poor. That would be called a poor value. That's a window. So a window, front door at 1.1 is okay. Getting down to 0.7 might be where we want to be with windows and doors. It's a different scale in terms of U values for windows and doors. But we felt for the front wall, 0.39 was actually with a render finish to the front. So that's wood fiber bonded to OSB. So what I like about this is effectively a dry system. It's a composite system, and the composite dry system we tend to think about is insulated plasterboard, all right, which just has a phenolic or polyisocyanated board bonded to plasterboard. Okay, that's the commercial system, cozy board or whatever word name they want to use for it. There's way too much of that used. It's extremely cheap. This, I think, is an interesting position. There are other great systems such as Ecological have here, like diathanite and calcium silicates and wood fibers, all sorts of different systems out there. But I felt this one was a nice system to use. The builder was concerned about how much wet trades there were. And at the time this was being built, there was an incredible shortage of tradespeople just coming out of the lockdown, during the lockdown. So it was really difficult. Even the roofer was saying to us, I will not be available to take the slates off the roof. If you want me, you need to get somebody else, a labourer, to take the slates off the roof. I'll only be there to put the slates on the roof. And he also said to me, don't even think about a conversation where we reuse, 50% of the slates of that building on the front and then go with, whatever fiber cement slates at the back. I'm not having that conversation. I don't have time. Literally, I don't have time. And this was a quality guy who was really hard pressed at a time when labor was so short on the market. So we ended up, the other thing I was told is, we'll give you a £2,000 discount if you go with fiber cement. And in a context where this was expensive and cost increases and blah, 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 we ended up saying, okay, we can't even go with a natural stone slate. We have to go with the fiber cement slate. And that's what we did for all that. And there is a carbon penalty there, but there was a kind of market considerations. Going back here again, like I said, the Pavadry system, it's from Cara Concepts. The suppliers are Cara Concepts in Ireland at the back of the room. This has a full bed of adhesive behind it. So once we trued up the lime plaster, which we had to remove due to the need to crack stitch and the fact that a lot of it was falling off and all these other things, when we trued up all of that, to be able to use effectively a dry system with the full bed of adhesive meant it was quicker. It was something that was maybe a lower trade skill level, but it also is fully capillary open and it has good density in terms of thermal mass and so on right to the end. We chose, probably slightly non-conventionally, to slab plasterboard directly onto that to get the room finish. And we chased into the OSB to put our cabling, but we sealed the chases that we made. So we thought that was quite, a useful thing to do to kind of keep things tight. Another approach is to surface fix those cables, have a small batten and plasterboard and so on. Now, in terms of, you get my little code here on the left-hand side. Here, we're looking at foamed glass aggregate. So 2 layers installed of 300 mil, compacted down to 250. I can provide all these details, by the way. There'll be higher quality as a PDF. But compacted, that's really important. Separately compacted 300 to 250, 300 to 250. And then you can literally, carefully walk across. You wouldn't run across it, but you'd carefully walk across it comfortably. But we then laid a geotextile. So geotextile below and above. And then you're casting your limecrete slab directly onto that. The builders, Serious Construction Limited, SIOR IUS, they're very conventional builders. They're not eco builders or necessarily low energy builders, but they're very trustworthy. And I wanted to go with for such a small complex project, I needed to go with a builder who was willing to engage with me and I knew was as straight as a die. And I can't say any more than that. So they weren't used to limecrete, but they gave it a go. And they read the manuals, they talked to a few people, and we'll tell you more about that in a moment. Then we've agglomerated expanded cork. And remember, cork is bark of the Portuguese oak that every 7 years is stripped off and is an extraordinary product you can make anything with. You're using bark as an amazing product. So that was our edge insulation to reduce any thermal bridging. We used the Rockwool, very dense Rockwool you're seeing at the end of the table there on the outside, instead of the normal EPS or XPS type insulation in terms of thermal bridging. We've got you can see the fins above that. You've got rain screen, you've got concern about vermin, you've got concern about ventilation. You've got the thinner board being used at the back, so 40 plus 11, because we've also got the rain screen. And that's experimental. I'm trying to see what the difference is. There's less insulation, but there's no liquid water delivery, and the ventilated zone of the timber has some value too. So I'm going to be doing a U-value measurement of this and comparing it to the front wall I showed you a moment ago. Looking at the extension now, so we've just had two drawings of the existing building and the measures made, and now we've got two of the extension. We went with Timber Tech Homes, which is a small timber frame company ran by architectural technologists, the O'Mahonys, and they were very willing to talk to us about a small, difficult project, and they did a great job. They delivered timber cassettes to site. So there's extra timber because you've got a lintel condition for a patio door there. But if you can imagine the racking board here, which we talked about, is the AM Eco board, basically recycled Tetra Pak waste. You've got Irish timber, and believe it or not, in Ireland, to say there's Irish timber in an Irish timber frame is impressive, because I think only one mainstream timber frame company in Ireland typically uses Irish timber. Smaller timber frame companies do as well, but really most of what we get built in Ireland from timber frame is Swedish. Possibly a bit of Finnish, possibly a bit of Polish or Latvian or whatever, but mostly it's Swedish. And it's wonderful timber from Sweden, but it's not Irish timber. We export 80% of our timber to abroad, and the vast majority of that goes to Southern England. So there's a question there, and Culture and the sawmills and the board mills are very aware of that. We're trying to bring the timber frame companies into that conversation and so on. But to use Irish timber in an Irish timber frame in an Irish building is unusual. So you've got the racking board, you've got the timber frame, and then we slabbed over with wood fiber, and that came to site as a cassette. You know, there were panels. They brought about 12 panels to site, and that was the whole building. Delivered the extension. And then this was built in that there were rafters that were then located and then slabbed over with the wood fiber. But this is what you'd call a warm stud buildup, in that all of the studs, and you can see there's quite a lot of them in some cases, are effectively warmer because there's 50 millimeters of wood fiber insulation outside that. There's then a Solitex membrane, the blue, and in fact it took us a while to get the roof tiles and battens up onto the roof, and even longer to get the fins of thermopine on the side. I had no worries whatsoever in that whole period. So there was lashing of rain, but there was well-applied membranes of the appropriate kind on a thermal insulation, which is designed to be somewhat resilient to those conditions. And it's all vapor permeable, it's all capillary active, and it's all fantastic insulation. I mean, look at this, and then all insulation from front to back. And then this on the inside face is the Papa Textile insulation, which is the bluish one you can see there on the front. That's recycled denim. It's recycled trousers. And that is our services zone insulation throughout the extension. Okay, so it's almost like two different types of buildings. We're still talking about 38 square meters here, but it's 120 square meters of external envelope and a lot of thinking. And then you can see the airtight measures, Tescon tape being used, etc. But we didn't actually need to put airtightness tape on the racking board because we felt it was sufficiently airtight. And we wanted to prove that. And we had a great airtightness tester who was able to help us with that. So that was, again, a bit of a gamble. Would it be airtight enough? And just look at U values. Passive house windows here, pretty good. I think there are even better than that, but that's pretty good. And then you're down to really super insulated values here with other elements. Moving on to the bottom of those walls, we see again in the new build, the foam glass aggregate. Now we've got the Alma Vert structural insulant, which is from recycled plastic bottles. This is all from recycled glass bottles. That's from recycled plastic bottles. And that's the kind of greenish board you're seeing there, a fantastic product. And again, that's available from Partel and Hiroski at the back of the room. So we had a high carbon concrete footing. We'll talk more about that later on. And then no fines concrete blocks above and below. But I felt in this condition it was important to have a thermal break. Otherwise, we're relying on the timber and it'd be a poor, poorer condition otherwise. Students in the year one of the postgraduate certificate in building performance, energy efficiency design, code TU412, in their thermal bridge calculation module, over 2 years have evaluated the thermal bridge impact of these designs. So last year they were looking at one group were looking at the timber frame extensions, and then this year they're looking at the cottage conditions. So again, kind of trying to gather knowledge that focuses on a particular building as a way of having a national discussion. And then the rest of that you're familiar with. And again, some pretty good U values there over on the right-hand side. Here's our friend here in the kitchen. I don't know if it's easy to understand, but you basically got this is in the extension. You've got your kitchen unit, you've got your workspace, you've got your overhead cupboards, 1 meter high, and above it we put another low line of cupboards. Actually, they didn't come out, they're on the same plane, but they're 800 mil high. And that meant we could put all our ducting and our Areco fan behind a door, out of sight, within a larger kind of scheme, extract ventilation, the moisture extraction to the outside there, pulling from the kitchen at a high level. So where's moisture generated in the kitchen? Well, it's from us. We sweat, we breathe, we cook. The extractor is here. So there's an extraction here, which goes up there. But what happens? Very often people take the pot off the hob, they move over here and they pour the hot water down the sink. Where does all the moisture go? It certainly doesn't go up there. A portion of it does. The rest of it goes up here. It goes to the top of the room, and that's where we need extraction. We need constant extraction at the point where moisture is going to accumulate for the period of time that it's relevant. And that's why having constant ventilation, constant extraction at a low level is really clever. And like I said, DCMEV is the system we used. Areco is the particular company, but that has a value there, as well as the extractor at a low level there. And it's all tidied away in the upper level there. And the tenants can use that if they want, but otherwise that's our space and this is their space and this is their space and so on. And then in here with the shower room, we've got extraction there, and there's a little store space above the shower room. So we're extracting again directly over the point of moisture production, which is the shower head. There's no point in having moisture extraction, which is so often happens at the window. Somebody says, I've got the window open. Or you even have an intermittent fan located 200 millimeters, and I've seen it all the time, from the window, and you've got a little closed loop happening down here. Meanwhile, the moisture generation's over there, and then somebody wonders why they've got mold somewhere else in the house, or the ceiling is falling down, and so on. So we got to think about those sorts of things. Indoor air quality is massively related to moisture. Other things too, but a lot of it's to do with removing moisture properly. So in that context, we got a proper design. We gave, in this case, this particular company a drawing. They marked it up with the relevant technology. We talked about a plan, how many bends affects the acoustic quality. If those that are coming later on, we'll see how quiet it is. And then we've got air supply to the dry rooms, the 3 dry rooms, and we've got moisture extraction from the 2 wet rooms. And like I said, we can swap this out in the future if we want to, and if we've got the budget to a different system. We've allowed for that. But I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing I should say, because I'm not going to say it, I'll come back to it in a moment. Well, sorry, I'll say it because I'm not saying it. There's a store area above here because this wall is vertical. This is a monopitch. So this is the low point and this is the high point. That faces directly south, well, pretty much directly south. We've allowed for solar panels on that roof in the future. So we've all electric heating at the moment, but we've allowed for solar panel. We've got power from here up to there. So the right kind of cabling, the right kind of controls are all there. We've even got a pipe going through the roof buildup, which is properly capped. And we've got a roof tile, which can be snipped off, the little kind of the nipple or whatever you'd call it, to snip off to bring through a cable so that in the future we can easily install without any faffing and without anyone breaking through my lovely air tightness lines, etc., a renewable energy supply with optimum orientation. So that's allowed for. It's not in this budget, but it's allowed for. In terms of other things, just in terms of, I suppose, store systems, we've simply got electric rads, electric wall heaters. This one there, they're this size because they only need to be this size. They're tiny. Under that window, under that window, under that window, and there's one on that wall there. There's also a little towel rail in here. All of them are electric heated. These 3 are from Dimplex. So Dimplex is an Irish company. Yes, it's electric heating. It's not storage heating. We could have put storage heating in. We didn't. But they're all working from a common hub, which I can control on my phone. And again, that can help with energy reduction and control and quality and so on. And then we've a little, believe it or not, a little 5-litre under-counter heater that heats the hot tap here and the hot tap in there. And we've a normal electric electric shower in the shower room there. So it's an extremely simple services system. We've been penalized heavily because it's all electric without any storage heating and without at the moment any renewables. And you'll see that later listening to Shane. But you know, I'm happy with it for the moment, and it's easy to control and it's relatively simple. And there's very few fans. The only fan is that fan in the house. And you know, sometimes we have to look at complexity. We need robust, simple systems as much as possible, easy to repair, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the ventilation system has been separately controlled, third party, and commissioned and certificate issued. Again, really important. So now a few slides about construction stage. Okay, got about 10 slides left. Okay, so a few slides from construction stage and then a few bits on circularity. So there's the Alma Vert, possibly used a bit more than we needed to, but great product. And we were able to just build it in and slab it. And it can take a nail fixing and all those sorts of things. There's us opening up that hole initially. There's putting in the steel goalpost with the low thermal bridging conditions here. And then this is the zone of the foamed glass aggregate. That's a little local pad under that. But obviously the rest were back to basically to ground. And they just whacked the ground. So quite simple, laid the geotextile down and then built up the floor. There's the there's the geocell foam glass aggregate arriving. It is after compaction with the geotextile arriving across. Here we are with little fibers which go into the limecrete slab, which give it a certain ability to kind of flex instead of a kind of a reinforcing, increase its tensile characteristics. But it's all vapor open and really lovely material. There's the agglomerated cork. That's the patio door condition there. That's the bottom of the sole plate of the timber frame. Those going in there. We can see the other materials, other things going in here, and so on. You can see the hessian laid down. This was laid in December, but it was laid December inside. Laying it in December outside could be problematic. But the hessian allowing for kind of a uniform slow drying. There's the TimberTech Homes installing their frameworks. These are the AM acoustic, the AM meter boards that you're seeing there as our racking board for our timber frame. Here we are with the various membranes installed really well. You can see the original structure and so on. I'm speeding up, as you noticed. You got the Intello membrane. You know, you've got to be careful about not all airtightness membranes work as well as others. I'm sorry to say that's a personal view, but you've got to be careful also about the installation. How well is the installer? Does the installer know what they're doing? Here's Roman Shapura, who is the doyen of airtightness and blowing cellulose in Ireland. And he comes from Sligo. He was very careful and very kind to come and join us. And he did fantastic work. And you can see the Pavadry boards going in. You can see the two different thicknesses of that. You can see Gavin O'Shea helping us with the airtightness. You can see kind of the engagement with testing and what's going on, and you can see, damn it, we've run out of tape, we need more tape. You can, all those conversations, you can see it happening. And we achieved, like I said, 1.6, which was less than we wanted, higher than we wanted, but you know, still a good value. There's an image of the inside of the house. And some of you will see that today. It's quite simple in the end of the day. You can see the lovely cladding on the outside in the yard. You can see a little bit of wallpaper there, picking up the areas that are kind of would have been there originally. We made new architraves. The old architraves couldn't really be saved, but we replicated the form of them. We saved those doors. They are the original doors from 1886 that we've refurbished with the original strapping. The locks are new, but the strapping's original as well. And that door, I'll tell you about that door in a moment. That's a nice story, and so on. That's the MVH door system, the Compact P system that we couldn't put in, that we decided not to put in, but we've allowed the void for that system in the future. That's what it looks like over there in the left. Great system. We discovered this is what we were looking at when we took off the plaster, and like I said, much of it was falling off. We found this kind of quality and a bit of packing going on and the cracks and whatever else, and my heart sank. And there's the lintel, but separate to the lintel then is actually a subframe to take the original cast iron windows. And you can see them there, the cast iron windows, and then there was no lintel. The subframe was the lintel for the door effectively, and that's only 100 millimeters, and it hadn't cracked. I couldn't believe it. But we've realized the windows at that stage were on site. They were in Ireland. They weren't on site. They were in Ireland, and they weren't going away. So we needed to buy new, lovely American white oak, €1,000, to make new subframes, to take out the subframes we didn't know were there, to then install windows. So these are some of the painful moments. This is amazing. Again, these two pieces of timber are here. This is the original Baltic pine on the left-hand side. I counted 120 growth rings across that piece of timber. This is wonderful, and I sincerely mean wonderful, timber from Glennon's, and there's about 13 growth rings there. So this is the highest, the quickest carbon sequestering material, barring hemp in Europe, barring hemp and bamboo in Europe, grown in Irish forests, sick as spruce, provided by one of Ireland's biggest timber sawmill company. And this is fantastic. And we should absolutely be using this timber, and we're not using enough of it when we need to use it. But why in God's name use a new material when you've got an existing material in perfect condition already there? And the interesting thing was both the engineer and the foreman were both encouraging me very, very strongly not to do that, to get rid of all the old timber and to use the good stuff, to use new material. So why would you use old material? You want this house to be fit for purpose for the next 100 years. That timber there on the left is going nowhere. That's fantastic, and its carbon penalty has been paid. In fact, there's a little carbon penalty. It's sequestered so much carbon over so many years. So, you know, those conversations can happen, and they're on site, and you're kind of going, oh my God, what do I do? And it was only when I was standing on the roof with the roofer, and we're looking up close, 200 millimeters from the timber, that we were going, oh my God, this is gorgeous. There's nothing to do here. And the only bit of timber we needed to remove was the fascia. Even the sole plates, which I wasn't expecting, were perfect. So good conversation there. This is the conversation about reduction, talking to the engineer, names not mentioned, but this is the original foundation. And I think that's something like 550 mil or something of concrete that was being proposed to underpin the back wall. He was assuming this was the foundation and the back wall of the site, which is also the back wall of the property. And we had a long conversation to reduce the concrete down to sizes that were acceptable. But I spent so much time in that conversation, I never thought to have the conversation about using EcoSem or changing the specification, improving the low carbon characteristics of the binder. So you have one conversation that stops the other. But this was going to take place of all my lovely installation as well. So, you know, you have to have those conversations. And sometimes you need to change your design team. Sometimes you're not talking to the right person. So a bit of way to go there in some cases. This is all the lovely timber we saved. Obviously, it had to be denailed. A few extra bridging creases, good to go. And then here are the original ridge tiles, which were sourced near Bristol in England. We were actually able to identify where they originally came from, the clay fields, and they were dry fixed. They weren't actually wet bedded. There is a dry fixing system for ridge tiles. And if you're putting these onto new asbestos slates, to have wet cement dripping down the face of your new slates is not great, but you can dry fix it and it works perfectly well. So these are other measures, I'm not going to mention them, that we used in terms of a reuse agenda. And then in terms, there's my lovely wife, in terms of a joinery and a reuse agenda, that's the door that she walked through for all her life until 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And that's the door that is now the internal door in the house. This is the door that her father took from an architectural salvage shop in 1971. It had been a door with solid panels. He reglazed it in 1971 and he made it his porch door. The original whole door from 1922 is behind it. But this actually turned out in the airtightness test that we did on this house. This is Aylesbury Gardens. This is another of the build to last projects. It turned out that, you know, an airtightness of 12 in that house. It was a very leaky wall and we were very leaky door. And one of the measures, he now has a good air quality, airtight door in that location. And we've inherited the door for a beautiful door in the middle of our house, in the middle of the cottage. And these other measures here. And then there's the crack stitching, so repair, a lot of repair to do. Tried to remove the 10 mil distortion in that door I just showed you, couldn't do it, but we've actually just adjusted the frame instead. And so on. And then the pots, the new mortar, the flushy brush, all the good stuff there. And then the old pine, these were old pine beams, so you can still see the original nail holes and bits and pieces, but we bought new floorboards cut from historic pine beams. And then I'm almost there. You're now going to hear a talk from Shane Fenton, where we're looking at building energy modeling. And you can see there was an approach taken by IHER, so Michael Hanratty is here today, and they deliberately looked at an all defaults approach to the building energy model, and they looked at a model using the specification and more accurate information. So they deliberately did what somebody is able to do going to the building and what they and everyone else would like to do more generally. But both of those methodologies are allowed for currently in the code of practice for BER assessors, and there's quite a difference that you're going to see. And then the next thing that Shane's going to talk about is where digital construction technologies provided a point cloud scan of the house for us. Shane in Wayne Moorhead Architects created a BIM model. They created a common data set in terms of volumes and lengths of materials, and that was used by him in the passive house modeling package, which is a different kind of building operation. It's an operational building energy model instead of an asset rated based building energy model. And then Sarah Kerrigan then took the same data to apply to a life cycle assessment. And I am done. Thank you.